In Gravity Rush 2, you play as Kat, who along with Sid and Raven were sucked up in a gravity storm and thrown into another part of the world known as Banga Village after the events of the original Gravity Rush. Kat is separated from Raven and her pet cat Dusty and loses her ability to shift gravity. Kat and Sid work as miners to repay their debt in Banga Village while trying to reunite with Raven and find a way back to Hexville. Gravity Rush 2's gameplay is nearly identical to the originals with some subtle changes. Your core ability set is still changing the influence of gravity so Kat can simulate flying by falling in any direction. The effectiveness of the gravity kick has been heavily reduced. This is both good and bad as it makes the other forms of combat more useful and viable. Unfortunately, it also leaves a bit of a void in the pure aerial combat which, like the original, takes up the majority of the final parts of the game. The stasis field and throwing objects got a pretty hefty buff, which turns Gravity Rush into more of a third-person shooter at times. When combined with the gravity slide to boost around the battlefield, throwing objects at larger enemies can be really satisfying and fun. Overall, everything just behaves better and more like you'd expect. Gravity sliding is much more fun and effective as a means of getting around. It provides a really viable alternative to just flying everywhere, which is exactly what it needed to be. Gravity Rush 2 introduces styles with Normal, Lunar, and Jupiter. Normal behaves identically to the original Gravity Rush. Lunar is low gravity and allows for slower falling and much higher jumping. Jupiter is heavy gravity and impedes your movement but hits significantly harder and provides a faster gravity slide. The styles all get unique attacks, and the various special attacks from the original are now delegated to individual styles. The addition of styles is nice and well implemented as you can quickly swap them on the fly with a quick swipe of the controller's touchpad. In general, I liked Lunar because it's fun to jump really high and the wormhole kick and extra tracking on basic attacks was useful. I mostly stuck to Normal and Lunar but used Jupiter mostly for large concentrations of smaller enemies. The styles do provide a better sense of progression than the original Gravity Rush. The one thing I will be critical of them is that your gravity power consumption feels way too high while using them. Wormhole and surge kicks drain your power like crazy, much higher than normal gravity kicks. Graphically, it's a blanket improvement over the original. The jump from a Vita game to a PS4 game is pretty staggering. The graphics, draw distances, and effects like entering storm clouds are all greatly improved. Most cutscenes are still handled by comic book style exposition, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it works alright in the game. The camera in Gravity Rush 2 has some issues, just like the first game. Most notably is when you're in corridors or other tight spaces. The camera will freak out and it'll take a little while to get readjusted. The camera is for the most part better than the original game, but when the issues do come up, they are significantly more noticeable, annoying, and take longer to correct themselves. They also appear to come up more frequently, but that's likely because of the more indoor and otherwise claustrophobic environments in Gravity Rush 2. It's unfortunate, because when the camera's good, it's a lot better, but when it's bad, it's much worse. The original Gravity Rush forced you to use trains to get around to the various districts around Hexville. Thankfully, in Gravity Rush 2, that's completely eliminated. You're no longer gated through plot progression, you can fly around to all the various areas of the city right from the get-go. It's a welcome change and makes the world feel less constrictive and more believable. The soundtrack features a lot of redone tracks from the original. The new music is all pleasing and fitting. Just like the original, there's no voice acting, and instead there's a made-up language, so you will have to rely on subtitles and text. Plot-wise, the original Gravity Rush was a series of seemingly unrelated events that were strung together with no resolution. Gravity Rush 2 has similar issues, but at the very least, the separate plotlines of the first and second half do actually feel well constructed and fleshed out. Even though the plotlines are separate, they do kind of come together in a way that makes sense in a reasonable finale. The characters really are the best parts of Gravity Rush's story. Both the returning characters and the new cast are endearing, and many of them do have enjoyable arcs. Gravity Rush 2 does give you a bit of bait and switch, and the credits will roll without answering any questions from the first or second game. Thankfully, you do get an extra final chapter which definitely answers some of the questions and concludes the game in a fairly satisfying but in a rather abrupt way. Gravity Rush 2 feels easier than the previous game. Just like the original game, there is some difficulty associated with spatial awareness and adjusting to the unique movement mechanics. In Gravity Rush 2, you have a much wider array of viable combat options, and the Nevi you do fight are all significantly less annoying to deal with than in the previous game. Gone are the extremely tedious multi-core flying enemies, and the Nevi are much smaller in scale and easier to deal with this time around. Gravity Rush 2 also introduces generic soldiers and a few mechs, so there's immediately more diversity in the enemy types. The soldiers are really easy to beat, but the new mechs do behave extremely similar to Nevi with having to hit glowing weak points. For a lot of the heavy combat sections, you're also accompanied by Raven, who's AI controlled. Raven's AI is decent, You do have to do the majority of the legwork, but Raven does pick up some of the slack and will damage and eliminate some enemies. Raven will also assist you for certain combo attacks, letting you deal more damage. It's a nice little addition and helps make the game a little bit easier. There are far too many stealth sections for my taste in both the main game and in side content. Cat's skill set is just not conducive to sneaking around, so when the game forces it on you, it's definitely a low point. The guards and people you're meant to be tailing are also a little too aware, making these sections a chore to get through. I found them to be by far the most tedious parts of the game outside of the final battles. The difficulty does ramp up appropriately throughout the main game. The few boss fights do feel like an unnecessarily large difficulty spike. The final encounters especially do feel a bit ridiculous. They are quite hectic, and it's often hard to get your bearings because of everything going on, just like the original Gravity Rush. You're also liable to be killed in a few hits during these sections, and the bosses can hit you multiple times in a single attack. Expect to take some deaths that legitimately feel unfair. I played on normal, but the additional options of hard mode for extra challenge, or easy for people struggling or looking for a casual game to play are welcome changes. Gravity Rush 2 is a much bigger game than the original. It's about twice as big in scale and in length of the main story. Doing a handful of the optional missions and focusing on the main story, Gravity Rush 2 was completed in 14 hours, 23 minutes, and 12 seconds. The free Raven DLC was completed in 1 hour, 47 minutes, and 30 seconds. The pacing of the main story feels appropriate. I do dislike the rather jarring transition that occurs at the end of Chapter 2, as it feels a little out of the blue and there was still some stuff that kind of felt like it needed to be wrapped up. Chapter 3 onwards feels like a rehash of the second half of the original Gravity Rush, which was a bit disappointing. If you want a lot of content, there's tons of optional missions in Gravity Rush 2. There is a new edition of the mining missions, which are used for getting talismans. Talismans act as accessories and boost certain abilities. You can spend a lot of time in the mines min-maxing talismans if you want, but the game is beatable without grinding for them. There is more variety in the side content. The optional missions are more fleshed out than the previous game's challenges. They have more backstory and characterization rather than a string of killing X enemies under a time limit or doing a race with an empty gravity gauge. Although those challenges do still exist, there's at least a little flavor to them this time around. In my opinion, the free DLC is worth exactly what you paid for it. I would honestly consider it totally skippable since story-wise it adds very little and trivializes a major plot point in the original game. The actual content of the DLC is just lacking. It's a nice addition for free, but to me it was more of just the worst bits of Gravity Rush 2. The beginning is a stealth section, followed by a lengthy scavenger hunt. Afterwards, there is a unique section involving defending and capturing regions, which was fun, but kind of underdeveloped. Then 2 boss fights that get immediately recycled, followed by a giant enemy. It may be more enjoyable if you're getting Gravity Rush 2 now, to play the DLC first, then get into the main game. After clearing Gravity Rush 2, then doing Raven's Story DLC, it felt pretty underwhelming. Gravity Rush 2 really is a sequel done right. It fixed most of the problems of the original game, kept the charm, and was just a bigger and better experience all around. The camera is the worst of the technical problems. It frequently will freak out and take a little too long to reorient itself. This happens just too many times to be forgiven. I respect that the story did have a reasonable conclusion, even though it did feel a bit abrupt. If you liked Gravity Rush, this is more of the same. So the question remains, do you need to have played the original to enjoy Gravity Rush 2? I don't think so. Gravity Rush 2 starts off with a relatively clean slate and gives you the necessary background to understand the context of the game. Playing the original will give you a bit of insight into the events of the game, but I would say it's not required to play and enjoy Gravity Rush 2. Gravity Rush 2 gets recommended playing's most prestigious verdict of recommended.